For our final speakers, we're going to have Jamie switch roles and become one of the speakers, where he'll now be joined by Mike Hartley, both from the MITRE ATT&CK team. So take it away, guys.
Thanks, Adam. And like I said, this is Jamie Williams here. I'm here with my friend Mike Hartley, and we're giving you an update from the attack team on what's happening with pre-attack. So it has been a truly crazy 2020 in many ways, and even just for the attack team. We started the year doing sub-techniques. We released beta. We released the final in, I believe it was July. We've been growing cloud, and then recently we released the network platform as well as ICSs and sticks. So like any attack consumer, you might have noticed in the most recent release that attack normally grows vertically. We see new techniques, new sub techniques, but in this release, attack for enterprise got a little wider. And this is because we merged the previous pre-attack matrix into enterprise. So Mike and I are going to give you a little more detail on what happened there, as well as some transparency and insight into the decision making that went into this process. So first off, this didn't happen overnight. This wasn't something that we just, decided this year and implemented. You might have seen this graphic previously. This was included, the entire idea for this merger was included in our 2020 roadmap, as well as if you followed ATT&CKcon last year, Adam actually presented an introduction for what we were thinking here. So, big picture, this is something that's been kind of on our minds for a while, and it just has been implemented as of version 8, this most recent release of attack. So a little background about pre-attack. It was initially released in 2017 as a separate matrix from enterprise. So it had its own 17 tactics. Long story short is when you think about a kill chain, enterprise typically focuses on what we call post-compromise or right of boom, where pre-attack was kind of thinking left of boom, the behaviors that an adversary would execute leading up to compromise. So thinking of things like, deciding on targeting, deciding on, what are the priorities are, gathering information about their victim, staging and developing resources, things like that. And pre-attack really opened up some really interesting use cases. Most importantly, how do you get ahead of a breach? As a defender, how can I see artifacts of an adversary getting ready to target me, whether it be, setting up domains, tracking botnet activity. These are really important considerations, especially when you start thinking about open source intelligence requirements, like, where do we need to look for, and, in the public space to actually start seeing, adversary activity before it's actually in our environment. And like I said before, this wasn't something that happened overnight. Dating all the way back to version 2 of attack in 2018, we actually started to pull bits and pieces of pre-attack over into enterprise. Particularly in this case, the initial access tactic was actually populated from 2 tactics that were previously in pre, launch and compromise. So like I said, this is something that's, we've kind of always had the desire to kind of bring these 2, pre and post compromise matrices and thoughts together. And finally in version 8, we've actually achieved that. So like I said, this most recent release of attack version 8, we've officially deprecated the pre-attack matrix. It is still available, via our versioning, but going version 8 forward, pre-attack is deprecated and has been replaced by the pre-platform in enterprise. So pre will sit next to Windows, Mac OS, Linux, network, cloud, all those other platforms within enterprise. As you can see, and graphic on the bottom right is perfect example of highlighting this. Pre-attack was huge. We had to do a lot of rescoping, a lot of down select to get it into the 2 tactics that are now in enterprise. And just kind of giving you some transparency into the thought process that went into that. To kind of match everything currently in enterprise, we had 3 main criteria for translating these techniques. First of which was the behavior had to be technical. It had to be something that an adversary is doing with a host or a system, or something which kind of leads something technical, which leads to our second point. It had to be something that was visible to a defender. It's great to think about adversaries making decisions and kind of having their own board meetings and kind of defining their priorities. But to match the rest of the enterprise, that's not something we're going to see. It's not something we can actually defend against. So it really, unfortunately, didn't have a place in enterprise. And finally, in the spirit of attack, everything's based on open source in the wild. It had to be something that we actually had evidence of seeing adversaries do this. So it kind of, as you can see, the technical aspect being visible, all that cascades into that in the wild documentation, public reporting criteria that we use to build the rest of attack. So like I said, finally, the final merger, we've pulled initial access before, and then the final merger included the creation of 2 new tactics. As you can see on the bottom right, Reconnaissance and Resource Development. So kind of just diving into the first tactic, reconnaissance, you can kind of think of this as, pre-compromise discovery. This is an adversary, actively or passively gathering information that they're going to use during targeting. In terms of just stats, reconnaissance is 10 techniques, 31 sub-techniques, and really interesting nuance about it is it's split into two categories, more or less. There's the, what information is the adversary, gathering, whether it's about your host, your infrastructure, your personnel. You can kind of think of those, as well as how. How is an adversary actually gathering this information? Are they scanning for it? Are they sending you phishing probes? Or are they, kind of triaging and combing through publicly available information?
Thanks. The resource development tactic is focused on an adversary trying to establish resources they can use to support operations. So that includes techniques that involve adversaries creating, purchasing, or compromising and stealing resources that can be used to support targeting. Resources here include infrastructure, such as buying or compromising servers or domains, accounts, such as creating or compromising email accounts or creating and developing a social media persona, and capabilities, such as developing or downloading malware exploits. While there are 6 new techniques and 26 sub-techniques here, please don't let that scare you. There's a parallelism among and within techniques that helps make use of these more manageable. As part of this release, we've also added a new pre-platform tag, as these behaviors don't fit neatly into Windows, Mac OS, Linux, cloud, network, or any other existing platform. We've also added a new pre-compromise mitigation, as often these behaviors are outside the scope of preventative measures and Enterprise Defender can typically take for detections and data sources. As Jamie said, everything going in here is visible to some defenders, but many are not observable to most Enterprise defenders. We've highlighted some data sources and detections in cases where there are detections applicable to a broad set of defenders, such as using domain registration information to detect adversaries purchasing domains, including things like monitoring for domains registered that are similar to your own. That might be used for something like credential harvesting. In some cases, we also have pointers to related post-compromise behaviors where detection efforts may be more fruitful. So why do this? We hope to promote community adoption and contributions around tracking adversary reconnaissance and resource development efforts, and to have more integration across the wider spectrum of adversary behaviors. As Jamie mentioned, for the version 8 release, we have deprecated pre-attack. However, previous versions of attack will retain the pre-attack matrix in case you aren't ready to make the switch quite yet. So you can still use pre-attack in version 7.2 and earlier on our website, in the sticks, and in the attack navigator. So how can you help? As we've said, attack is very focused on the community. So feedback and contributions would be greatly appreciated. Looking for things like new techniques or scoping of existing techniques, documentation of potential detections and mitigations, and of course, reported instances of in the wild adversary procedure examples. Lastly, we want to give special thanks to a few people, including MITRE's Ingrid Parker for working with the attack team to develop the criteria for determining what pre-attack behaviors could assimilate into enterprise attack. We also want to give special thanks to former attack team member Katie Nichols, along with current head of attack Adam Pennington, for whiteboarding sessions to determine the techniques and sub-techniques that fit those criteria. And lastly, a thank you to Kristen Esbeck for leading the creation of pre-attack, which much of this work was based on. And that, folks, is how we helped put the pre into attack. Thank you, and back over to you, Jamie.
And I'm just going to thank everyone again for joining ATT&CKcon, as well as, in advance for all the contributions to the pre-effort. And with that, I'll turn it over back to Adam for a sign-off.
And thank you, guys. Mike and Jamie will be available for questions in the Slack. Jamie's not going to ask himself questions today. Thank you again to all of today's speakers and for everyone for joining us. There's been some great discussions in the Slack, which hopefully will keep going after we're done here. Links to videos and slides from today will be emailed to everyone who registered once they're ready to be put online. And we'll be getting those out to everybody as well. Please join us for the next ATT&CKcon Power Hour on December 11th. Registration is open today, and thank you again for joining us.